Hello, friend. Welcome to part 8 of the Space Between YouTube series, in which we're exploring the space between the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. I have a question for you here at the beginning. What do you know about the Samaritans? We know the story that Jesus tells about the Good Samaritan, and kind of the underlying understanding of that story and why it's so scandalous is because the Jewish people in that time hated the Samaritans, right? Like Jesus in John talks to a woman at a Samaritan well, and it's a big scandal when his disciples come back as well. There's special mention of going through Samaria. There's mentions of the Samaritans accepting Jesus when the early church goes up there after the persecution. But we're never really given a good explanation about why there's such animosity between the two groups. And so in order to answer that question, we need to dig deeper into a man named John Hyrcanus. Now, you may remember, if you were listening very carefully last week, I did mention his name. He is in that line, the Hasmonean kings. You'll remember the Maccabees, Judah Maccabees and his brothers who had started the revolt, and then when they had won independence, had taken on the role as leader and high priest of Judea. And there's this back and forth independence, and then independence gets taken away, and there's battles and there's fights with the Seleucids, and they never really get true, lasting independence, but they come close a whole bunch of times. And when John Hyrcanus takes over, the Seleucids put out an all-out attack on Jerusalem, and he loses badly. And he loses their independence. He bankrupts the treasury. The people hate him because of the way that he treated them during this time. He lost all respect, and for all intents and purposes, it looked like his reign was over. You know, in order to pay the tribute to the Seleucids as an apology for, revolting, he had to raid the tomb of David. Can you imagine the sacrilege of, first of all, discovering the tomb of David, which had been lost, but then raiding it and taking probably the modern equivalent of $1 to $2 billion worth of gold, or about 3,000 talents. But he had the luck that while he was doing his duty to the Seleucids, they totally just fell apart. This whole Seleucid empire. The leader died, and there was just inner turmoil, and they just lost territory, and it became impossible for them to govern Judea. So John Hyrcanus was like, all right, well, I guess we're independent now, kind of just by default. Like they'd been fighting for so long to get their total independence, and it finally came to them in about 110 BC, simply because the Seleucids fell apart. There was no one left to oppress them. And we had said before that they had already made friends with the Roman Republic, and so they had some protection. The Spartans, the Athenians, they all were all like, yep, great, Judea, you're your own thing, and now go for it. And so John Hyrcanus now wanted to expand Judea. It wasn't enough to just have Jerusalem and then the surrounding area. He wanted to bring back Israel as it was under David and Solomon, in the previous glory of it all. Remember, these people kind of felt like they were the Messiah that was predicted in the prophets. They were going to bring back glory to Israel. The God's chosen people would take back the promised land for the first time in 1,000 years, and it was going to be amazing and triumphant. But they had no money, and his army was totally shot because of his loss to the Seleucids. And so he took some of that $1 billion that he stole from David's tomb, and he hired a mercenary army, which, on a side note, seems really appropriate because David himself was a part of a mercenary army, and David was a warrior who had conquered a lot of this land to begin with. So it kind of seems full circle to use David's wealth to do this. And after he defeated the people who were living there, the Canaanites and the Greeks and the various other settlers who had made this place their home for probably 1,000 years, he deported them, or he enslaved them, or he just killed them. He was fairly ruthless. And then he sent settlers Jewish settlers to those places to go found new cities, and gave them money to relocate and make a new life for themselves out in the newly conquered areas. One of those places that was newly conquered and settled was Galilee, by the way. And so this is probably why two of the Gospels include a genealogy for Jesus, because Jesus was from Galilee, and it had only become a part of Judea about 100 years before his birth. And so it wasn't a guarantee that if you were from Galilee that you were actually Jewish. And so you need the genealogies in there to prove to people that this Galilean was actually Jewish. It would be like, an American 40 years ago being born in Panama. Like, you don't know if this person's Panamanian or if they're American. It depends on where they were born and who their parents were. Probably also one of the reasons why that northern area of Israel was so well known for its revolutionary tendencies would become the birthplace of the Zealot movement a little bit later. So I want to tell you about another place that he utterly destroyed. Samaria. So let me back up a little bit here so you can understand why it's such a big deal about what John did in Samaria. So you may have heard this story before, and I may have been the one who told you this story before, that the Jews hated the Samaritans so much because after the Assyrians conquered the northern 10 tribes of Israel in 722 BC, they deported everyone, and then they brought in Mesopotamians to live in the northern part of Israel and to intermarry. And so the people up there were only partly Jewish, and they said that they worshipped Yahweh, but it really wasn't. It was some syncretistic thing. And so the Jewish people hated them because they were half-breed phonies. I may have told you that at some point, and if I did, I apologize. In further learning and research over the years, I have come to find that we really only get that narrative from Josephus. Well, he's at least the first one to say it, and he's a first-century Jewish historian, a Pharisee, and somebody who notoriously hates Samaritans. So he is already in that time and place where there's already a ton of racial tension and hatred and prejudice against these people. And so this story about their origin is just drenched in that racism that he himself probably internalized and didn't realize that he even had. He probably thought he was being fair. Because, modern DNA evidence of the Samaritan people, because, they're still a people, show that there is no Mesopotamian. There are no evidence in their DNA today that they were ever forcibly intermarried with Assyrians and the people from Mesopotamia. In fact, the Israelis to the south and the Samaritans to the north share basically the same DNA. They're the same people, genetically speaking. And so we know that this story of intermarriage and interbreeding is probably just propaganda of some kind. So then we have to ask, do the Samaritans get a story? Do they have an origin story that explains things? Well, them being persecuted pretty harshly, they don't have a lot of written material, but from what we do have, according to them, they say that in the time of the judges, there was a breakdown during the high priesthood of Eli. You may remember Eli. He had a couple of really bad sons, and then there's Samuel who took over for him, and then Samuel appointed Saul and David and then Solomon. So we're in the end of the book of Judges in this story. And according to them, the priesthood was in Mount Gerizim, in the northern part of the kingdom. They said that Mount Gerizim was the original place of worship when Joshua came into the promised land, and that was the center of worship for the Israeli people. For the Israelites, rather. And then there was a breakdown in the sons of Eli, And some of them went down to Shiloh and eventually to Jerusalem. And those who went down did so because of their heresy, because they were no longer allowed in Mount Gerizim. And so the worship of Yahweh in Mount Gerizim is the oldest and the most sincere and the most authentic expression of the worship of the God of Abraham. This is their story. And that when the people of Judah came back after the Babylonian exile, you'll remember from one of our first videos, right, with Ezra and Nehemiah, and they were rebuilding the temple down there, the Samaritans sent down word that they would like to help rebuild it. And the people in Judea said, "No, you all are unclean. We don't want your help. We don't know if we can trust you." And that really hurt the Samaritan people, and so they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim, where they've been having regular worship for hundreds of years at that point. And in their worship up there, they have their own Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They've got their own version of it. It's pretty much the same. There's obviously some differences in terms of where things take place and who is doing the things. But otherwise, I mean, in terms of practice and belief, it's fairly consistent with the Jewish Pentateuch that would be developed in the South later. So they had their own Bible, and they claim to be descendants, and genetically they are descendants of Joseph, the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat guy. And so if the Jewish people have this origin myth for the Samaritans that they're half-breed idolaters, and the Samaritans have this story for the Jewish people that they are half-bred idolaters, then what's the truth? What's really going on here that would have caused such deep animosity between these two people? Well, I mean, if you read through the Bible and the historical books of the Old Testament, you'll see that there was never really a unified kingdom, right? When Joshua came in, they came in as tribes, as 12 distinct tribes, who then were kind of held together by some loose form of worship and language and shared culture, but not really government. And then you had Saul and David and Solomon, and those are the only kings who ruled over all of it. And all of their reigns were plagued with war and civil war and unrest, and the different tribes never, ever got along. And under Jeroboam, after Solomon, the kingdom split, and there was a civil war, and lots of people died. And so, the North and the South have never gotten along because they are just so culturally distinct. Can you imagine such a situation and how that would turn out? And then during the Greek period, which we've been talking about, in all of the times that the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are fighting over Judea and enforcing their rules on them, the people of Judea tend to fight back, and the people of Samaria go, "Whoa, all right, well, they're not us, so you can have them. We're not going to rebel as well." And so the people of Judea saw them as traitors, where they're like, "Look, we're kind of cousins, aren't we? Then why aren't you helping us?" And so you can kind of tell that there's this. It's like in sometimes they're seen as one and the same people, and other times they're seen as very different, distinct people. They're like brothers who love each other but also kind of hate each other, and disrespect each other but also respect each other at other times. It's kind of a strange relationship that they have. And so when John Hyrcanus and his mercenary army come into the land of Samaria, they utterly annihilate every single Greek city that's in that area, the way that they did in Galilee and other places. But when they get to the big Samaritan cities of Samaria and Mount Gerizim, where the temple is, he doesn't kill everyone. And he doesn't send settlers up there. If you look at the archaeological record, it seems that there's not a ton of change in population during that time period. But what he does do is he burns down every single center of worship that they have, both in Samaria and on Mount Gerizim, which you'll remember, the temple in Mount Gerizim to them is like the temple in Jerusalem to the Jews. And so the act of coming in and burning down their temple is like what Nebuchadnezzar did before. Horrible, just sacrilege. And we think, at least we're reading between the lines here in a lot of ways. But the reason why he did this was not to conquer them the way that he conquered the Greek cities, but to incorporate them. Because they were children of Abraham. But they were just worshiping on a different mountain, and they saw themselves as a distinct people. And John, you'll remember, is both king and high priest in Jerusalem. So by destroying the temple and their seat of government, he is consolidating his own power, and he is telling them, you can now come worship down in Jerusalem, which you'll also remember is the national bank. So this is a way of him getting more finances as well as consolidating his power. This would be like uniting the Korean Peninsula, right? They're the same people, but they're very distinct, and they have a long history of conflict between the two. And, surprise, surprise, the Samaritan people did not greet him as the great unifier. They saw him as an evil and wicked man, like of end times caliber. And so the Samaritan people would never recognize the Jerusalem as the holy city. They would never recognize that temple or its priests or the king as divinely appointed. And they, swept up in that apocalyptic fervor that everyone was swept up in, was just waiting for the day when the Messiah would come and rebuild the temple on Mount Gerizim. And in the intervening years and decades after that, there would be all of these skirmishes in which the Samaritan people would ransack cities and burn down cities of the settlers, and the people of Judea would retaliate and burn down their cities. Actually, very similar to what's going on now with the Palestinians and the Israelis and the settlements and the different borders and territories and all of that. It's kind of an ancient problem that they've had. And this was the beginning of a new policy for John Hyrcanus, in which when he conquered a new land, instead of just annihilating them outright, he would offer them the choice of either destruction and forced slavery or surrender and forced conversion, which is highly unusual. This is the only time in Jewish history that somebody has offered forced conversion as an option. So remember, a lot of the religion of the Jewish people to this point was that they are a people who have a religion. It's not a religion that makes a people. They are a people. They are the children of Abraham. They are a tribe, a people who then have a religion, a God that they worship. And so to offer these Gentiles the option to convert was highly strange and unusual. And so when John's conquest was done, and he had indeed conquered more even than Solomon had reigned over, you had the Jews in Judea, and then you had the Samaritans, who were totally just Israelites in belief and in custom, but who were rejected by the Jews and who rejected them in turn. And then you also had Gentiles who were forcibly converted into Judaism and only kind of accepted into the fold, but never fully. So you had the people who were in, and then the people who should be in but weren't in. And then you had the people who shouldn't be in but weren't fully accepted. So in retrospect, probably not the best plan for unification. Might have just been flawed from the start, and it falling apart was going to happen one way or the other. And one of the Gentile people that he conquered was a group of people just south of Judea called the Idomians. And these people were circumcised, and they were made to follow the laws of Moses. They were Jews of a sort, but never really fully acknowledged. However, there was a man among them named Antipater, a man from Idumea, who would rise to prominence in a few years. And I I don't imagine that many of you know the name Antipater, but you probably do know the name of his son, Herod. You know, King of the Jews, the kill all the babies in Bethlehem guy. Yeah, but hey, we're going to talk about him next week. And also, we will get to talk about the only queen of Judea, the bloody conflict between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and what to do when your Savior ends up being a horrible person. So, until next week, I'll see you then.